The night was heavy with expectation, captured in silence, their wrists bound. The German spies were marched through narrow corridors lit only by weak bulbs. They had prepared themselves for screams, for the sickening crack of whips, for a descent into dungeons they had only heard whispered about in Berlin, every nerve braced for pain. And then, as the door opened, the shock came not from violence, but from something utterly ordinary. A table, 2 chairs, and a steaming cup of coffee placed gently within reach. For men trained to believe that America was a land of deceit and brutality, this was not just surprising, it was impossible. Interrogations in their world meant lights burning into their eyes, blows to the jaw, the snapping of bones until truth was forced out. But here, at a quiet facility in Virginia in 1942, the beginning of their trial was a question as soft as steam rising from the mug. Would you like some coffee? The silence in that room was heavier than chains. One of the younger spies, barely 22, stared at the dark liquid as though it were poison. His hand trembled, not from fear of pain, but from disbelief. Could this be a trick? A cruel setup before the storm? Yet the guard said nothing more, only slid the cup closer. The rich aroma of roasted beans filled the air, mingling with the damp wool of their uniforms, carrying with it a scent of comfort they had not known for months. Coffee was no luxury in wartime Germany. By 1942, substitutes of acorns and burnt barley filled cups back home, a bitter imitation of the real thing to these prisoners. The taste of genuine coffee was not just a beverage, it was an intrusion from another world, a reminder of abundance beyond the reach of the Reich. The first sip was hesitant. The bitterness spread across the tongue, followed by warmth that sank into their chest. No words were spoken, but eyes glanced at one another with confusion, even betrayal of their expectations, here, in the supposed lair of their enemy. Kindness had replaced cruelty, warmth had replaced cold, and coffee had replaced chains. The interrogators knew exactly what they were doing. This was not softness, it was strategy. To disarm a man, you could strike his body or you could strike his certainty. And at that table, the foundation of every spy's conviction began to crack. The sound of spoons stirring against porcelain was more unsettling than the imagined clang of chains. It was the beginning of a psychological war where the first weapon was not fists, but a simple gesture of hospitality. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And while you are here, let me ask, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? The story had begun not with screams in the dark, but with silence, steam, and a cup of coffee that tasted of something far more dangerous than pained doubt. They had crossed an ocean of deception before arriving at this moment, from Berlin's smoky briefing rooms to the crowded U-boats slipping across the Atlantic. The German spies carried with them a burden heavier than any suitcase the Reich's conviction that America was weak, decadent, and easily broken. Each man had been promised glory upon success, or death upon capture, yet none had been prepared for what awaited them once their boots touched American soil. The journey was long and secretive. In May 1942, Operation Pastorius unfolded a mission to infiltrate the United States with trained saboteurs. They carried explosives, codes, and promises to cripple industry, landing first on the beaches of Long Island and Florida. They imagined themselves agents of terror in a vulnerable nation. But within weeks, betrayal from within their own ranks doomed them. George John Dash, one of their leaders, confessed to the FBI, exposing the mission before it ever bloomed. The capture was swift, but for the men themselves, it was a descent into the unknown. From Berlin's perspective, capture by the Americans meant only one thing: torture. The Gestapo's own methods left no doubt of what they would have inflicted on enemy spies in return. Whips, fists, and sleepless nights defined interrogation in the Reich. So when the prisoners were led through Brooklyn's streets, eyes darting at the city alive with neon lights even during wartime blackouts, they felt certain the nightmare would begin at any moment. But New York did not look like a nation on its knees. It glowed. Cafes buzzed with life, factories operated through the night, and trains screamed across steel bridges. These details cut like knives. One prisoner later scribbled in a hidden note that he had seen more abundance in a single American street than in entire German provinces. A line that read like quiet treason. Transported under heavy guard, they were taken south to Virginia, to an unmarked compound. The official records referred to it only as P.O. Box 1142. The trip itself was jarring. Passing through small towns, they glimpsed American families at diners, soldiers smiling with sweethearts, even children clutching chocolate bars, for men raised on endless speeches about American poverty and chaos. The sights were more punishing than any whip. One of the spies, Carl Gimpel, had written in his diary before capture that America would be a land strangled by jazz, crime, and racial decay. Yet as his train rolled past vast farms larger than German provinces, he was forced into silence. The propaganda posters in Berlin had not prepared him for the sheer size of this country, its endless railroads, its ceaseless rhythm. When they finally stepped onto the grounds of the camp, they were not greeted with screams or fists. Instead, a soldier pointed toward the barracks and muttered, "You'll be fine here." That casual kindness unsettled them more than a shouted order could have. It was as if America did not need to prove its power with cruelty. It was written already in its scale, its abundance, and its confidence. By the time they were seated in the small interrogation room with coffee waiting, the journey itself had already loosened something deep within them. Their world of certainty, of Nazi strength, of American weakness had cracked open, and all it took was a train ride, a glimpse of neon, and the quiet clatter of a coffee cup. The walls of Fort Hunt seemed unremarkable from the outside, nestled in Virginia. Its official name never appeared on maps. To the outside world, it was simply P.O. Box 1142, a bland address for a facility that carried out some of the most unusual interrogations of the war. For the German spies brought here in 1942, this place was supposed to be where silence was broken by force. Yet what awaited them behind the closed doors was a theater of psychology rather than pain. Interrogators at Fort Hunt were not chosen for cruelty. They were linguists, psychologists, historians, and even German émigrés who had fled the Reich. Men like Major L. F. Spencer understood that knowledge. Not bruises, won wars. They studied their captives' files, practiced their dialects, and even learned their favorite German football clubs before meeting them face to face. To the prisoners, this felt like sorcery questions so precise, so disarmingly personal, that lies felt pointless. The first step was always the same, but passage. A seat at a plain wooden table, a steaming cup of coffee, or, on some days, a plate with bread and butter. The silence that followed was crushing. No lights in the eyes, no fists on the table, just the slow, steady clink of a spoon stirring sugar. One spy, Herbert Haupt, later confessed in a guarded note that the waiting was worse than beating. The Americans were not in a hurry. They let the prisoners sit with their doubts until the enemy began to speak simply to fill the silence. The gossip of the camp carried quickly. Prisoners whispered in their bunks that one of them had been offered a cigarette. Another asked about his mother's health. These details unsettled them more than cruelty ever could. How could an enemy know the name of a wife back in Hamburg? How could they sit across from a man who offered warmth instead of rage? The Reich had promised monsters. Yet here were men in clean uniforms asking if they preferred their coffee strong or mild. The statistics tell their own story. By the end of 1943, over 3,000 interrogations had been carried out at Fort Hunt. None with torture, nearly all producing valuable intelligence. The Germans, trained to resist pain, were unprepared for kindness. Confessions about submarine routes, code books, and safe houses spilled out faster than the interrogators themselves had expected. One evening, as dusk fell outside the wire fences, a group of prisoners sat together in their barracks. One muttered bitterly, "At least with the Gestapo, we knew what to expect." The others fell silent, each staring at their coffee cups, each aware that their world of certainty had slipped away. The Americans understood something profound to dismantle loyalty to an ideology. You do not always need fists. Sometimes all it takes is a question spoken gently, and the sound of coffee being poured. Life inside the camp settled into a rhythm that was stranger than any of the spies had anticipated. Beyond the interrogations, there were cigarettes to be bartered, bread rolls to be divided, and endless cups of coffee poured from tin pots that seemed to never run dry. If the interrogations disarmed them in silence, the gossip of the camp unraveled them in whispers. The bunks creaked with conversation late into the night. One prisoner leaned over to another and whispered that he had been asked not about sabotage or codes, But about his favorite football club, another claimed that an interrogator had remembered his sister's name, though he had never mentioned it before. They know everything. One muttered, staring at the ceiling beams. The others nodded uneasily. The fear was no longer of beatings, but of how much these Americans seemed to already understand. Coffee became both comfort and suspicion. In Germany, the last time they had tasted genuine beans was before the war. Ersatz brews of roasted acorns had long since replaced the real thing. Now, each morning, a mug of dark, aromatic liquid appeared on the mess table. One diary later uncovered described the shock in plain words: real coffee in the land of the enemy, it feels like betrayal to enjoy it. Yet the taste weakens the resolve. But it was not just food or drink that unsettled them. The generosity of rations stood in stark contrast to the hunger of their homeland. By 1943, Germany's rationing had cut meat to barely 200 grams per week. Here, American guards chewed thick sandwiches of ham and cheese during breaks, sometimes leaving half untouched. One of the prisoners confessed in frustration, "They waste what we would kill to have." It was a different kind of torment abundance flaunted not with arrogance, but as everyday normality. And then came the first conversations that pierced deeper than any question in interrogation rooms. An American guard, barely older than some of the spies, leaned casually on his rifle and asked, "You married?" The prisoner stiffened, unsure whether it was mockery. "I've got a wife back home," the guard added softly. "Haven't seen her in 2 years." A pause. Then the prisoner nodded, whispering, "Yes, a wife in Hamburg." For a moment. They were not soldier and spy, but two men separated from the women they loved. This was how the walls eroded, not through threats, but through small, human moments. Sharing cigarettes in the yard, a guard asking whether they preferred their coffee strong or weak, a passing smile in the mess hall. These fragments of normal life, denied in the Reich's prisons, became corrosive to the image of the American monster. One evening, as the lights dimmed across the compound, a prisoner scribbled a note in the margin of a confiscated newspaper. "They treat us as men, not animals. Perhaps that is more dangerous than chains." The gossip of the camp was clear. America's weapon was not brutality. It was the unsettling realization that kindness could feel heavier than cruelty. The real battle was never fought with fists inside those walls. It was fought in the minds of men. The German spies had been drilled to resist pain, told to grit their teeth through agony, to prove loyalty by enduring, yet at Fort Hunt. No blows came. Instead, each day began with the scraping of chairs, the smell of coffee, and questions that sounded less like interrogation and more like conversation. "Do you take sugar?" one interrogator asked casually, sliding a small bowl across the table. It was a detail that hit like a hammer. Sugar, something rationed almost to extinction in Germany, was offered here without ceremony. The prisoner hesitated, staring at the crystals, knowing that his comrades back home measured sweetness by the grain. At last, he stirred a spoonful into his cup. It was a gesture so simple, but in that moment, something inside him yielded. The Americans understood what the Gestapo never could pain Harden's resolve, but kindness unsettles it. In place of fear, they created contradictions. In place of threats, they gave familiarity, and slowly, one by one, the prisoners began to speak, not because they were forced, but because silence felt heavier when someone had asked about their mother, their football club, or their favorite meal. One statistic reveals the power of this approach. By 1944, over 95% of interrogations at Fort Hunt yielded useful intelligence, ranging from submarine positions to industrial secrets. The spies were trained to resist torture, but they had no defense against humanity. Their silence cracked not under chains, but under the weight of being treated like men. It is here that the story presses on a deeper question. If a single cup of coffee could achieve what hours of beatings could not, what does this say about the weapons we choose in war? The spies expected blood, and instead found mercy. They expected torment, and instead found warmth. And in that inversion, their world of certainty unraveled. One American officer wrote in his private notes, later declassified, "They gave us their stories because they could not reconcile the enemy they feared with the men they met." Those words ring with the power of strategy cloaked in civility. The camp was not free of tension. Some prisoners refused to soften, clinging to the Reich with clenched fists. Yet even they could not ignore the daily rhythm: coffee poured, cigarettes lit, laughter echoing from the guards' quarters. It was not torture that haunted them. It was the slow, steady drip of doubt. And now, to you, the listener across time, what do you think breaks a man faster, fear or kindness? Would you have resisted longer under the lash, or under the quiet sound of coffee being poured across enemy lines? Leave your thoughts. I want to hear where you stand. The truth remained at Fort Hunt. The strongest weapon was not hidden in shadows or behind locked doors. It sat openly on a wooden table, steaming, sweetened with sugar, and more devastating than any whip. The clash between propaganda and reality came into sharpest focus in the quiet moments, when the prisoners sat alone with their thoughts. For years, they had been told that America was a land of chaos, poverty, and corruption. Posters in Berlin depicted Americans as mongrels, ruled by greed, incapable of discipline. And yet, every day in captivity chipped away at that lie. The most striking contrast was in the food and drink. At home, families scraped together meager rations: 200 grams of meat a week, ersatz coffee made of roasted acorns, bread stretched with sawdust fillers. But here, guards set down trays of eggs, bacon, and coffee so rich it smelled of another world. One spy wrote in a torn scrap of paper later found hidden in his boot, "I feel more guilty enjoying their coffee than I would bleeding under their fists." Letters were written, but never sent. The censors intercepted every word, and most never left Fort Hunt in them. Fragments of humanity surfaced: a young man writing to his sister about the strangeness of being offered cigarettes by the enemy. Another confessing he had eaten more in 2 weeks of captivity than in 6 months at home. The words were filled with shame, confusion, and reluctant gratitude. And then there were the human encounters. A black American orderly once passed through the barracks, carrying supplies. The spies, raised in a society steeped in racial ideology, froze in disbelief. This man, whom their Reich deemed inferior, gave orders to white American guards and was obeyed without question. The silence in that barracks was deafening, more crushing than any shout. It was a moment that shattered another cornerstone of their indoctrination. These contrasts between propaganda and lived reality, between ideology and observation, were corrosive. The Reich's image of America as weak, decadent, and divided collapsed against the sight of factories running day and night, guards well-fed and confident, and coffee poured without fear of scarcity. It was not just coffee they tasted, but a world in which abundance and equality seemed stronger than fear. By the autumn of 1943, many of the spies no longer spoke in terms of victory. They argued instead about whether their families would survive the winter back home, whether the Reich could ever match what they had seen. One diary captured this collapse of certainty. "We were told America was rotten, but here, even prisoners drink better than our officers." And now, let me ask you, the listener, seated perhaps with a cup of coffee of your own, if everything you had been taught about your enemy fell apart in front of your eyes, would you cling to the old beliefs or let them go? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective matters to history. For the spies, the questions were not abstract. They were living each day in the ruins of their own convictions, and nothing symbolized that ruin more than the quiet, daily ritual of coffee poured by the very men they had once sworn to destroy. When the war finally drew to its bloody end in 1945, the spies carried more than chains back across the Atlantic. They carried memories, some bitter, some disarming, and one that lingered longer than all the rest: the simple act of being handed a cup of coffee instead of being beaten. For men who had braced themselves for whips, it was this small kindness that haunted them most. In post-war Germany, ruins stretched across every city, trains ran late, if at all. Hunger gnawed through households, and propaganda no longer filled the airwaves. Yet in letters written decades later, fragments returned to that strange paradox of their captivity in America. One former spy, now a gray-haired shopkeeper, confessed to his son that the first time he truly doubted the Reich was not when bombs fell on Hamburg, but when he tasted American coffee poured by a soldier who smiled. That moment had followed him through the rubble and into the silence of peace. Statistics reinforce the weight of these encounters. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 3,000 German spies, saboteurs, and prisoners passed through American facilities like Fort Hunt. the vast majority surrendered invaluable intelligence, not under lash or whip, but under the pressure of kindness, the survival of convoys in the Atlantic, the disruption of sabotage plans. Even the unraveling of Nazi codes owed much to words spoken over coffee cups instead of screams in cells. The stories filtered into post-war memory in quiet ways, a whispered admission to a wife, a diary entry folded into the back of a drawer, a letter that never left the camp but was copied by archivists years later. They reveal the same truth: the Reich's fiercest weapons were not broken by fire or blood, but by the collapse of belief. When the mask of propaganda fell, what remained was the taste of humanity, bittersweet and unforgettable. In the decades that followed, as Europe rebuilt and the Cold War hardened new lines, some of these men lived quietly in small towns, yet when asked, even years later, they did not recall their capture in terms of terror. They recalled the moment steam rose from a coffee cup, the room filled with silence, and they realized their world had been built on lies. The aftermath of war is measured not only in cities destroyed or treaties signed, but in the small symbols that linger in memory for these spies. The cup of coffee was more than warmth. It was proof that humanity could outlast brutality, that mercy could be a sharper weapon than cruelty. And so the image endures: a plain wooden table, a guard's steady hand, and a steaming cup of coffee sliding across the grain. No whips, no chains, no shouting, just the quiet realization that sometimes the most devastating weapon is kindness. The story of the captured spies and their unexpected encounter with mercy does not end at the walls of Fort Hunt. It lingers, like the faint aroma of coffee long after the cup has been drained. History often teaches us through violence the roar of bombers, the cries of the wounded, the ash that drifts from cities in flames. Yet here lies another lesson, quieter but no less powerful: that the smallest gestures can echo longer than the loudest battles. For the men who once believed cruelty was inevitable, a steaming cup of coffee became the moment their certainty unraveled. They had been raised on propaganda, hardened by training, prepared for pain. Instead, they met eyes that did not glare with hatred, hands that did not strike, and voices that asked ordinary questions about family and preference. That inversion gentleness, where there should have been violence, lodged deeper than any scar could. In the aftermath of war, when the world was rebuilding from rubble and graves, these memories resurfaced in unexpected ways: a son recalling his father's whispered confession, a diary page tucked away in an attic chest, an old man in a quiet village, staring into his cup decades later, remembering the taste of real coffee for the first time in captivity. These fragments remind us that even in the machinery of conflict, humanity can intrude like a beam of sunlight through barbed wire. Perhaps this is what history offers us when we look closely: not only the chronicles of destruction, but the subtle acts that redefined enemies as men, the spies who once swore loyalty to a regime discovered in silence and steam. That compassion could be more subversive than cruelty. And so we close with a lingering image: not chains rattling, not fists striking, but a soldier's steady hand sliding a cup of coffee across the table, a symbol of mercy that endures, reminding us that kindness can be its own form of victory.